You're beginning to see this written plan requirement may take some time and effort. Keep in mind, it's the company's guide to your hazard communications program and should be as detailed as possible. The plan should include a list of the hazardous chemicals in your facility and procedures for multi-employer work sites. The written program must be made available to employees and their designated representatives upon request. Policies, procedures, rules, methods, safety, and other information must be included in the written HAZCOM plan. Another important part of the written plan is emergencies. If employees are not properly trained to react to emergency spills, how can you expect them to react to spills, leaks, and other emergencies? Safety procedures are required for different types of chemicals. Location and types of cleaning supply is required, PPE requirements, and other information. Written procedures should also include alarm systems, rescue information, and evacuation procedures. Specific procedures for first aid treatment of overexposure to chemicals are part of the plan. Basically, all information and procedures that are needed by employees in all aspects of handling, storing, using, transporting, and disposing of hazardous chemicals and what to do in case of an emergency should be included in the written HAZCOM plan. Nothing should be left to chance. Waste minimization and substitution of chemicals for less hazardous chemicals should also be part of the written plan. This is not necessarily a requirement of the HAZCOM standard, but it makes sense to add additional topics to written policies that relate to chemicals and hazardous materials. Certain chemicals, due to their physical properties, exhibit physical hazards, including flammability, reactivity, and other properties. Physical hazard chemicals fall in the following classes: flammable liquids or solids, combustible liquids, explosives, organic peroxide, oxidizers, pyrophoric materials. These are materials that may ignite spontaneously in air at temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Unstable materials, water-reactive materials. Health hazard chemicals are those that may cause acute or chronic health effects after exposure. It can be an obvious effect, such as immediate death from inhaling a deadly chemical. A health hazard may not necessarily cause immediate or obvious harm to you, or even make you sick. In fact, you may not see, feel, or smell the danger. An acute health effect usually occurs rapidly, following a brief exposure. A chronic health effect is long, continuous, and follows repeated long-term exposure. As an example of what kinds of chemicals cause health hazards, the list includes carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals. An example could be formaldehyde or benzene. Toxic agents could include lawn or garden insecticides. Irritants may include chemicals such as ammonia or bleach. Corrosives are caustic sodas or battery acid. That's not the entire list, but it provides an idea of different types and kinds of chemicals. If you're experienced, you should know quite a bit about MSDS, or Material Data Sheets. MSDSs are factual information sheets that relate to chemicals. The manufacturer is required to provide the required information, and each employer is required to maintain these MSDS on file. Anyone who uses the chemical may then ask to see the MSDS to determine information that may not be provided on the labels. The employer may have all the MSDS information on an electronic database. The primary requirement is the MSDS must be readily accessible. If the company uses computers, a printer should be available to provide employees with a hard copy from which to read the information, particularly in a medical or emergency situation. Transmission of the MSDS information orally by telephone is not acceptable. To be realistic, the information on the MSDS is technical in nature, which may or may not be useful to users of the chemicals. Much of the MSDS information is used by engineers, safety managers, and others to determine the actual hazard of the chemical and develop policies and procedures for the safe use, handling, storing, and disposing of the chemical. The MSDS also provides information on what type of personal protective equipment is necessary and first aid procedures to take in case of exposure. When training employees in MSDS, it is not sufficient just to have them read the information on the MSDS. Training must be provided, and it must be delivered in the language spoken by the employee. Documentation of the employee understanding the training is also required. Some organizations have trade secrets, so they don't want too much chemical information exposed on MSDS. Even if a chemical is a claimed trade secret, the following minimum information is required on the MSDS: The PEL, or permissible exposure limit, and the TLV, or the threshold limit value, or other designated limits must be listed. Containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled in English. Generally, where there are non-English speaking personnel, the label should be in that language or languages also. Labels must contain the following information: identity of the hazardous chemical, appropriate hazard warnings, name and address of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. You may use signs, placards, symbols, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures in place of labels on individual containers, as long as the meaning is fully understood by the people using the chemicals. Where the chemical is intended only for the use of the employee making the chemical transfer, labels may not be required. This means the container must be used only by that person and must be used only during the work shift. If the container is to be used on another shift or by another person, then a label is required. Some common labeling terms include combustible, flammable, corrosive, irritating, and toxic. There are several systems and standards for labeling chemicals, but there is not a uniformly accepted system to date. Each system and standard has advantages and limitations. The ANSI, or American National Standards Institute, Z129.1, has a precautionary label containing the name of the chemical, a signal word, such as warning or danger, and the key hazard, such as flammable or vapor harmful. A statement of precautions to avoid the hazard is also included. NFPA 704 is another labeling system, which is a color-coded system. It uses a color-coded diamond with 4 quadrants, in which numbers are used in the upper 3 quadrants to signal the degree of emergency health hazard, which is blue, the fire hazard, which is red, and the reactivity hazard, color-coded yellow. The bottom quadrant is used to indicate water reactivity, radioactivity, biohazards, and other special hazards. The emergency hazards are based upon a numerical scale of 0 to 4, 0 having no unusual hazard, 1 equates to a minor hazard, 2 as moderate, 3 as severe hazard, and a 4 rating is an extreme hazard. The NFPA diamond is used primarily by emergency response personnel and does not adequately signal occupational hazards. The NFPA system is good for alerting personnel to the degree of hazard of the chemical and is helpful in drawing attention to storage needs and emergency equipment requirements. The DOT, or Department of Transportation labeling system, uses a color-coded diamond where there is a symbol and a term describing the major hazard of the material. The DOT system is used for the transportation of hazardous materials. HMIS, or Hazardous Materials Information System, is one of the most popular systems for labeling containers. It uses standard labels to communicate hazards through the use of colors, numbers, and letters of the alphabet and symbols. For as long as the HAZCOM standard has been in existence, there is still some doubt or misunderstanding of what training, documentation, and information is required for the Hazard Communications Program. First, employees must be trained at the time of your initial employment or assignment and whenever a new hazard is introduced into the workplace. Employees should be trained and made aware of what is required by the HAZCOM standard, such as labels, MSDS, the written program, potential hazards, and other general information. One thing that should be taught and fully understood by employees is that mixing chemicals without proper training and authorization is very hazardous. If you get the wrong mix of chemicals, you could be changing the physical or health characteristics. You could take 2 chemicals that, when used individually, are relatively safe. However, when you mix the 2 together, you could form a very dangerous or hazardous mixture. Don't mix chemicals unless you've been trained and authorized by your employer. Employees must be informed of any operations in the work area where hazardous chemicals are present. Employees must be informed of the location and availability of the company's written program. Employees must know the location and availability of the MSDS files. The training should include the observations methods used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals in the work.